Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russel Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and Distinguished Fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news, which will not include the Trump verdict, but our listeners should rest assured we will speak about it at length in the big conversation during the second half of this episode, about 15 minutes or so from now, so stay tuned for that. All right, first story of the week. Europe has only a fraction of the air defense capabilities needed to protect its eastern flank, according to NATO's own internal calculations, laying bare the scale of the continent's vulnerabilities. Russia's war against Ukraine has underscored the importance of air defense as Kiev begs the West for additional systems and rockets to protect its cities, troops, and energy grid against daily bombing raids. But according to people familiar with confidential defense plans drawn up last year, NATO states are only able to provide less than 5% of air defense capacities deemed necessary to protect its members in Central and Eastern Europe against a full-scale attack. Walter, news or faux news?
Honestly, I would need to see a lot more of that report to think it was real news. I'm certainly one of the people who thinks that NATO and the West generally has been inexcusably inattentive to our security needs, but 5% seems like a very large number, and you have to ask yourself, what's the scenario here? Does Russia have 10,000 more planes? It's sort of the Russians actually, while they're definitely hitting Ukraine with missiles and their planes have been sending glide bombs in and various other things, they're not exactly flooding the airspace of Ukraine. And Ukraine certainly does not have more military, air defense capability than Europe. So if you imagined that you needed to, if you were going to assume that Russia was going to attack everything from Sweden and Finland all the way down to Turkey with equal ferocity with everything, okay? But so far, while we have not done enough to help Ukraine protect itself here, we're not exactly just being swept out of the skies by an irresistible tide of Red Army manpower, air power. So this almost reminds me of some of those things you see, sort of every year they come out with the National Association of Infrastructure Engineers comes out and says we need 78 trillion, quadrillion, billion dollars in new infrastructure spending right now or we're all going to die, and, give the money right here. So I'd want to see a little bit more about that before I concluded this was like the real thing and that we're about to be run over by the Red Army or the Red Air Force.
All right, our second story. Western sanctions and export controls were meant to subdue America's enemies, leveraging the power of the dollar to strong-arm governments into submission without the bloodshed of military force. But according to the Wall Street Journal, they have inadvertently birthed a global shadow economy, tying together democracy's chief foes with Washington's primary adversary, China, at the center. Unprecedented finance and trade restrictions on Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, China, and other authoritarian regimes have squeezed those economies by curbing access to Western goods and markets. But Beijing has increasingly foiled those U.S.-led efforts by bolstering trade ties. The bloc of sanctioned nations collectively now have the economy of scale to shield them from Washington's financial warfare, trading everything from drones and missiles to gold and oil. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, I think, again, it's a little bit overstated in that, yes, they can trade a bunch of things, but in fact, do they want sanctions? No, they don't want sanctions. Do sanctions cost them money? Yes, sanctions cost them money. So I think we've passed for many, many years of absolutely foolish indifference to security threats and various inadequacies in our defenses. We're now sort of going this sort of feverish overdrive. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. Now, what is true and what is news about this is that sanctions are a wasting asset, and people respond to sanctions and they become better able to block you and better able to resist and offset them. So you really should not use them very often. And you should not use them lightly. Now, the United States of America is a serial sanctions overkiller. We just, it's it's horrible. I mean, I think you'd be hard put to come with a list of all of the sanctions that the United States government in its awesome moral authority has imposed. But again, I would say, part of the problem here is that sanctions do have particular weaknesses, but the fundamental problem is the United States of America for the last 30 years has not been serious about foreign policy. We spend much too much time sort of preening in the mirror, looking at how really moral we are. My goodness, we've smitten Uganda with our outrage because of their gay policies. We have absolutely let Rwanda know what we think of it because of X, and we're telling Sierra Leone, and we're blah 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 blah. It's not serious. It's contemptible. And we seem to be addicted to do it. And yes, in the end, over time, it actually becomes dangerous and counterproductive. Again, unfortunately, it's one of the few things that Congress can do when it wants to do something about foreign policy is impose sanctions. Ha ha ha! It's a very easy thing to do. It shouldn't be such an easy thing to do. And we have, I think, over the years, overburdened the international system, overburdened our own foreign policy, and we need to clean house here.
One semi-related follow-up about this kind of alternative trade bloc. I saw that Western sanctions on Russia have also led to increasing economic relations with Turkey, which has been buying a lot more Russian gas and re-exporting European goods to the Russian market. Do you see the potential for significant cooperation among these historically rivalrous countries, or will issues in like the Caucasus and Central Asia and so forth keep them more or less apart?
No, I think Russia and Turkey have always had a kind of complex love-hate relationship. For Erdogan, the good news is that Putin is weaker. Putin's Russia is weaker than the Soviet Union was. So in the old days, Turkey was a very reliable NATO member because it was absolutely terrified of the Soviet Union. These days, it's not as terrified of Russia. And when you're not as terrified, that means you have more options. And so the Turks have definitely been able to play with the Russians with a new sense of freedom. And that at the same time has given them more ability to sort of tell us to go boil our heads when they don't like something that we would like to have them do.
All right, final story of the week. South Africa's ruling African National Congress Party looks set to lose its parliamentary majority for the first time since the end of apartheid in 1994. As of Thursday night, the ANC was sitting at 42% of the vote, a plurality, but not enough to form a government without a coalition. The center-right opposition Democratic Alliance was second with 25%. The far-left Economic Freedom Fighters sat at 9%, and several smaller parties account for the remaining quarter. While the ANC is still expected to remain the largest party, the results mark a steep drop in support since 2019, when the party won with 58% of the vote. During the tenure of the incumbent ANC president Cyril Ramaphosa, the country has seen rolling electricity blackouts and average economic growth below 1% per year. Walter, news or faux news?
Honestly, I think it's a little bit of faux news in the sense that why did the ANC go below 50%? Basically because the Zulu party under former President Zuma ran independently rather than doing what they normally do, which is run in the ANC. Actually, if you added the MK vote to the ANC vote, you've got a majority, a smaller majority than they had, but it is nothing like the sort of epical transformation of the South African political scene. It's in that sense, it's a factional dispute inside the major party. And the question is now, it looks like there seem to be at this, and we're still a little bit early, there seem to be three possible coalition routes for the ANC. One, which would probably make foreign investors happy, would be to form a coalition with the DA, the Democratic Alliance, the larger, more, quote, business-friendly party. That if that happened, that would be the most stable majority and potentially the best, I think, best policy outcome. The MK, that would basically just figure out, okay, how much corruption is the MK going to get? What's its fair share of what's going on will be. And that might actually not lead to a lot of change in terms of policy. It's simply, who gets this portfolio with this lovely, lovely collection of patronage and so on that goes with it. The more alarming one, I think, would be the more radical party where, that wants things like land ownership transferred away from the predominantly white farmers who have a lot of it now to black farmers, sort of Zimbabwe-style policies that have not worked out well in the North and would be unlikely to work out well in South Africa. So in that sense, the ANC government could go any one of those three directions. I think it's probably going to try to continue, and we'll see. But I think the most likely thing is that it's going to kind of look to bubble and boil along with the same kind of mix of attempted reform and administrative improvement over here, corruption to these people over here to keep them happy and to keep them quiet, and just kind of generally keep muddling through. So what we could actually end up with is an election that produced a lot of ink, but did not actually produce a heck of a lot of change. But we'll see.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So, Walter, you might have heard that Donald Trump became the first former president ever convicted of a crime yesterday, with a Manhattan jury finding him guilty of 34 felonies for falsifying records to cover up hush money paid to a porn star in 2017. From the initial wave of reactions I've seen, you have those broadly on the left calling this a vindication of the rule of law and the American justice system, upholding the fact that no one, not even a former or possible future president, is above the law. And then you have those broadly on the right calling this a kangaroo court that officially makes us a banana republic. And then for everyone in between, from what I can tell, a few people seem to think Trump's conviction will be upheld in appellate court, which will examine some of the apparent weirdness around the case. The crime of falsifying business records in New York is a misdemeanor with a statute of limitations of 2 years. And in order to upgrade it to a felony, the case had to be made that the crime was committed in furtherance of another crime, which the judge and the prosecution reportedly had some trouble specifying. It seems they settled on a violation of federal election laws, which apparently no state prosecutor in any state in American history has ever charged as a direct or predicate state crime. There's also the matter of the judge in the case having apparently donated a small amount of money to the Biden campaign. The prosecutor had been a top official in Biden's DOJ until the Manhattan case began, and so on. But in any case, as the judicious centrist arbiter of the news, Walter, tell us, where do you fall on this spectrum? How do you think of this historic verdict? And I guess also, how historic is it really? Does this fall in the Watergate and Monica Lewinsky and Hamilton's affair and all the other great political scandals of American history, or is this something different?
All right. Well, I guess the place where I start with this, first of all, I will just say that as a general rule of thumb, when juries rule on facts, I don't usually argue about that, just because the jury has done something which I haven't done, which is sat and listened carefully to mounds and mounds of evidence. And when people decide 12-0 on a particular interpretation of facts, I think the presumption is that they knew what they were doing. That doesn't mean that they can't be overturned on appeal because of flaws in the trial or what have you. But I do actually think that believing in the justice of the jury system, again, there are exceptions, but on the whole, we ought to do that when we can. But one of the things that strikes me is, since I am so incredibly old that I can remember the Clinton administration and the Monica Lewinsky case, is the most amazing thing about this is the total flip between Republicans and Democrats. Because in the Clinton impeachment drama and the whole issue over Monica Lewinsky, where again the problem was that the president of the United States had actually lied to a federal prosecutor. That was where this thing ended up. Republicans, by and large, said, convict him, remove him from office. This is an unparalleled disgrace. That imagine that Bill Clinton could have indulged in some sort of conduct that would have been considered unbecoming in the Hall of the Saints, in heaven on high. And the Democrats said, you know what? You really should not sort of make all of this effort to turn what is in fact a kind of sordid and sad personal transgression into some monumental crime of state. So in that sense, everybody has simply been, led to a kind of a partisan read of this. And I guess the other thing that I remember from that is Ed Markey, who's a wonderful Massachusetts Democratic congressman. I remember him looked a lot like Jay Leno. At least that's how I remember him. And I remember him sort of saying, look, he says, what the president, speaking of President Clinton, did with that intern was wrong, and it was embarrassing, and it was disgraceful, and it shouldn't have happened. But on the other hand, lying about it, that actually was not such a bad thing. That, if you do something like that and it's embarrassing and it might be hurtful to people in your life and all of these things, of course you cover it up. What kind of a fool wouldn't? And I think I think that's actually not a bad moral basis for thinking about this whole thing. And if we do that, it becomes not some kind of fabulous move to put the full weight of the criminal justice system on this kind of tawdry, sad thing. Now, I'm saying that without any regard to statutes of limitations and technical things and so on and so forth. But it does. Those of us who remember the Lewinsky thing and the Clinton impeachment remember that actually the Democrats did very well in the next election. And there was this sense that the Republicans, by sort of trying to sort of drag Clinton's, private sins out there into the public sphere and so on and so forth, had really stepped too far. I would not be surprised on this case, which is not the same as some of the other Trump cases that are out there. I would not be surprised to see a pretty large proportion of the public coming to say, this is not a great thing. It's not something that we would want to see the president of the United States engaged in, and lying is bad, and lying on business records is bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you know what? Trying to keep your dirty laundry out of the public sphere is maybe not the worst crime that a human being has ever committed.
You've been in Ukraine this week, and we'll do a special Ukraine episode next week to talk about what you've seen and heard. But as far as you can tell, how's the Trump verdict being regarded in the outside world? Is it provoking admiration or disdain for the American justice system, or does no one particularly care?
I think it is simply the Trump show. American democracy for my entire life has been the greatest show on earth. People, for everything from Watergate, there was, President Johnson showing his gallbladder scar to reporters. Not only that, I think he picked up beagles with his, baby beagles with his, by their ears in a way that the scruff of their neck or something. How could you have possibly done that? I mean, who can forget John Fitzgerald Kennedy being serenaded "Happy Birthday to You, Mr. President" by Marilyn Monroe in a skin-tight, skin-colored gown? America is larger than life, and Donald Trump is larger than life. And so I think what we're seeing mostly is the great American show. Oddly, that's actually one of the things that some people like about us. It's easy for people to think that, when America does something bad or improper, people hate us. And when we stand up to nobility and we're so wonderful, then people love and admire. Admire us. That's not really how a lot of these things work. There are a lot of people around that just sort of like the idea of a big country where there are big figures and big things happen. Maybe another way to do it might be to compare us to, say, Italy when Silvio Berlusconi was their leading politician. And surely, oh my goodness, it was not hard to find people. Oh, it's just so bad what Berlusconi is doing. He is so lowering the tone of national life. But a lot of people actually around the world just said, oh, it's Italy. This is what they do. And again, as I think we may have discussed this on an earlier episode, Jeremy, but it turned out that for Silvio Berlusconi, having the reputation of somebody who was chasing teenage supermodels across the deck of his yacht, that was a lot better for his political career as he reached 80 years old or whatever, than for people to say he's over the hill, he can barely walk, he's has to wear old man shoes so he doesn't fall over. And so again, I think from the standpoint of Donald Trump, of all of the kinds of criminal cases that could come up, of all of the embarrassing scandals, a nice little sex scandal here is just not the worst thing that could happen to him.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Like I said, we'll do a full special episode on Ukraine next week, Walter, but to give our listeners a teaser in the meantime, give us your favorite book or essay or movie or anything else that's helped you understand Ukraine.
Honestly, the thing that's helped me understand Ukraine the most is in about 1990, when it was still part of the Soviet Union. I drove all the way across Ukraine, coming up from Russia, southern Russia, going to Crimea and coming out through Lviv and western Ukraine out through Ushgorod. So that's, once you do something like that, a real road trip in a country, you got a feel for things that even now, after more than 30 years, is still really helping inform the way I look at the country. And a lot of things have changed. But I would say that, the book that I've found the most useful, at least recently, is this book, Our Enemies Will Vanish, which is an account of the war by my Wall Street Journal colleague, Yaroslav Tremofev, which is really it's just a very, very good look at what happened after the invasion. And that obviously is the biggest thing going on in the country even now. And to have, be able to sort of put that in your mind. And he does a terrific job of bringing a lot of the human stories. I've certainly seen some of the battlefields that he writes about, and have even met some of the people who were involved in the events he describes. It's a very useful book.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russel Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.